The bazooka in Tommy Brennan's hands did not belong to him. Its owner lay bleeding 10 feet away, eyes locked on Tommy, with a look that said everything words could not. Do not let me die for nothing. December 21st, 1944, 6:03 in the morning. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, and every breath Tommy took felt like swallowing broken glass. He knelt behind a collapsed beam in the ruins of an abandoned coal processing plant somewhere near Stavelot, Belgium. His gloves were torn, exposing fingers that had turned purple from the cold. He could not feel the trigger. He would have to squeeze it with his entire hand and hope for the best. 30 yards ahead, through the shattered doorway, 5 German Panzer tanks were rolling toward the bridge. Behind them came 3 half-tracks packed with infantry, and behind those supply trucks carrying ammunition and fuel. The sound of their treads grinding against frozen earth filled the morning air, like the growl of some massive predator closing in on wounded prey. Behind Tommy, inside the wreckage of the factory, 5 American soldiers lay unable to move. One had a shattered femur with bone visible through torn flesh. Another was missing most of his right hand. A third had taken shrapnel to the abdomen and was being held together by bandages and prayer. They could not run. They could not fight. They could only watch Tommy and wait. He had exactly 1 rocket. The rest of his unit had retreated or been killed in the artillery barrage that had torn through their position 30 minutes earlier. The radio was dead. No reinforcements were coming. No orders would arrive. There was only Tommy, 19 years old, a private first class, from the coal mining town of Scranton, Pennsylvania, holding a weapon he barely knew how to use, against an armored column that could reduce him to vapor in seconds. The position he had chosen was what any officer would call suicidal. A diagonal angle 25 yards from the road, completely exposed with no cover and no escape route. If he fired and missed, he would die. If he fired and hit, he would probably still die. The Germans would see his muzzle flash and turn every gun they had on his position. But this was the only angle that would let him hit the side armor of a tank. The front armor of a Panzer was too thick for a bazooka to penetrate. The rear was vulnerable but impossible to reach from his position. The side, however, was a different story. If he could catch a tank as it slowed down to navigate the bottleneck before the bridge, he might punch through. Tommy's hands trembled, not from fear, though he was terrified, from the cold, from the weight of the weapon, from the knowledge that 5 men were depending on him, and he was about to do something that made no tactical sense whatsoever. He looked back at the wounded men one more time. Corporal James Sullivan, the one they called Red because of his bright copper hair, was watching him. Red was the unit's anti-tank gunner, the best in the company, the man who had destroyed 4 German tanks in the past 6 months. The bazooka Tommy now held had been Red's until a shell fragment tore through his shoulder and back. Red's lips moved. Tommy could not hear the words, but he understood them anyway. "You know what to do." Tommy turned back toward the road. The lead tank was entering his field of vision now. A Panzer Phi Panther, its long barrel swinging left and right as the commander scanned for threats. Behind it came a Panzer IV, then another Panzer IV's carrying infantry on its hull. Tommy did not aim at the first tank. He did not aim at the second. He waited. To understand why Tommy Brennan chose to stay in that frozen hell instead of running for his life, you have to understand where he came from and what he learned before he ever picked up a rifle. Tommy was born on June 29, 1925 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, a city built on anthracite coal. His father, Patrick Brennan, had worked in the mine since he was 14 years old. His mother, Catherine, cleaned houses for the wealthy families on the hill. They lived in a narrow row house on a street where every family had at least 1 man underground. When Tommy was 12, his father died. There was a collapse in shaft number 7. 7 men were buried under tons of rock and earth. Rescue teams worked for 3 days before giving up. They never recovered the bodies. The only thing that came back to the Brennan family was Patrick's helmet, dented and covered in dust. That night, Tommy asked his mother a question that would shape everything that followed. Why did the shaft collapse? His mother did not know. Nobody knew, or at least nobody would say. The mining company blamed the workers. The workers blamed the company. An investigation was opened and quietly closed. Tommy's father was gone, and no one could tell his son why. That uncertainty haunted Tommy. He needed to understand how things worked, why they failed, What warning signs preceded disaster? He became obsessed with mechanics, with systems, with the logic of cause and effect. At 13, he started working part-time at his Uncle Mike's garage. Uncle Mike was a former Navy mechanic who had served on destroyers in the Great War. He was a hard man with grease permanently embedded in the creases of his hands, but he knew engines better than anyone Tommy had ever met. Machines don't lie, Uncle Mike told him on the first day. If something's wrong, there's a reason. Your job is to find that reason before it kills somebody. Tommy learned to listen to engines. He could tell from the sound whether a timing belt was slipping, whether a bearing was about to fail, whether a fuel mixture was running too rich or too lean. He developed an instinct for patterns, for sequences, for the small details that others overlooked, but that made the difference between a machine that worked and a machine that killed. He never finished high school. There was no money for it, and besides, Tommy learned better with his hands than with books. By 17, he could rebuild a transmission blindfolded. He could diagnose problems that stumped mechanics twice his age. He had a gift, his uncle said, a way of seeing how things connected. But there were no good jobs in Scranton during the war. The mines were closing. The factories were laying off workers. When Tommy tried to enlist on his 17th birthday, the Army turned him away. Too young. He waited exactly 1 year counting the days and walked back into the recruitment office on June 29, 1943. He did not join because he was patriotic, though he was. He did not join because he hated the Germans, though he had seen the newsreels. He joined because the Army promised training, steady pay, and a future that did not involve dying underground like his father. Basic training at Fort Benning was unremarkable. Tommy scored average on his rifle qualifications. His instructors noted that he was quiet, disciplined, and good at maintaining his weapon. Nobody identified him as exceptional. He was assigned to the 30th Infantry Division, known as Old Hickory, and shipped to England in early 1944. He landed in France shortly after D-Day and got his first taste of combat in the hedgerow country of Normandy. The bocage, they called it. Ancient farmland divided by earthen walls topped with dense vegetation, creating a maze where the enemy could be 3 feet away and invisible. Tommy's best friend in the unit was a kid from Cleveland named Danny Morrison. They had met on the troop ship crossing the Atlantic and discovered they both liked working on cars. Danny wanted to open a garage after the war, just like Tommy. They talked about going into business together, Morrison and Brennan Auto Repair, maybe somewhere in the Midwest where land was cheap. Danny died on their 3rd day in combat. Their half-track took a direct hit from a German anti-tank gun. Tommy was 30 yards away when it happened. He saw the flash, heard the explosion, watched the vehicle erupt in flames. Danny was still inside. Tommy could hear him screaming, could see him trying to climb out with his uniform on fire. There was nothing Tommy could do. The ammunition inside the half-track began cooking off, spraying shrapnel in all directions. By the time it was safe to approach, Danny was gone. Just a blackened shape that had once been a 20-year-old kid who wanted to fix cars for a living. That night, Tommy stopped believing in luck. He started observing, taking notes, paying attention to the small details that determined who lived and who died. He studied how German tanks moved, how they positioned themselves, how long it took for a turret to rotate. He learned their formations, their tactics, their blind spots. He carried a small notebook that his mother had mailed him, and he filled it with sketches and observations. Range estimates, angles of attack, the specific sounds that different vehicles made. His handwriting was cramped and barely legible, but the information was precise. One entry made after a battle near St. Lo would prove crucial. German tanks move in tight formation, disciplined but vulnerable. If you stop the middle vehicle, the whole column jams. Not the first, the middle. Tommy did not know it then, but that single observation would save his life and the lives of countless others 4 months later in a frozen factory near Stavelo. His fellow soldiers noticed the change in him after Danny's death. He spoke less. He watched more. They started calling him the quiet kid because when he did talk, it was short, direct, and usually important. Some thought he was shell-shocked. Others thought he was just strange. But Red Sullivan saw something different. Red was 26 years old, a former shipyard worker from Boston who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor. He was the company's anti-tank gunner, a role that required patience, precision, and the willingness to hold your position while several tons of enemy steel rolled toward you. Red had destroyed 4 German tanks since Normandy. He was very good at his job. One evening about 2 weeks before the German offensive, that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Red found Tommy sitting alone near the motor pool, sketching tank diagrams in his notebook. "What are you doing?" Red asked. Tommy showed him the drawings. Red studied them for a long moment, flipping through the pages, examining the angles and calculations. "You know something most gunners never figure out," Red said finally. "It's not about hitting the target. It's about hitting the right spot at the right time." Tommy looked up. "How did you learn that?" Red smiled. "Shipyard. When you're welding hull plates, if you hit the wrong spot, the whole sheet warps. You have to understand the stress points, the weak places where one small change affects everything else. War's the same way. Right spot, right time. One shot changes everything." He handed the notebook back to Tommy and pulled out a cigarette. Then he said something that Tommy would remember for the rest of his life. "If anything happens to me out there, you know what to do." Tommy did not respond, but he understood. It was not a request. It was a transfer of responsibility. Red was telling him that the knowledge mattered more than the man, that what Tommy had learned needed to survive, even if Red did not. 2 weeks later, the Germans attacked, December 16, 1944. 200,000 German troops surged through the Ardennes forest under cover of fog and snow. Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last desperate gamble on the Western Front. The goal was to split the Allied lines, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The Americans were caught completely off guard. Many units were overrun in the first hours. Communication lines were cut. Positions changed by the hour. Chaos spread across the front like wildfire. Tommy's unit, Company K of the 120th Infantry Regiment, was stationed near Stavelot, a small Belgian town with a bridge crossing the Amblève River. If the Germans captured that bridge, they would have a direct route west toward the Allied rear areas. The orders were simple: hold the road, protect the bridge, do not retreat. What no one told them was that a Panzer column was already on its way. The forward anti-tank teams had been destroyed. The radio was jammed and could not reach battalion headquarters. Tommy and his comrades were standing directly in the path of German armor, and they had no idea it was coming. On the night of December 20th, Tommy pulled guard duty with Eddie Montoya, a 21-year-old private from New Mexico. Eddie's mother ran a bakery in Albuquerque, and Eddie dreamed of opening his own shop after the war. He talked about recipes, about the smell of fresh bread in the morning, about how he would name his first pastry after his grandmother. "Are you scared?" Eddie asked as they watched the dark tree line. "Always," Tommy said. "Then why don't you look scared?" Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because being scared doesn't help anything. Only doing helps." Eddie laughed softly. "You sound like an old man." "I learned from an old man." They did not know it was the last normal conversation they would ever have. At 5:30 in the morning on December 21st, German artillery began falling on their position. The world exploded. The factory walls crumbled. Men screamed. Sergeant Kowalski, the unit commander, took shrapnel to the head and died instantly. Red Sullivan grabbed his bazooka and ran toward the anti-tank position. He had almost reached it when a shell detonated nearby. The blast threw him sideways and drove metal fragments deep into his shoulder and back. Tommy sprinted through the chaos and dragged Red into the shelter of the ruined factory. Red was conscious, blood soaking through his uniform, but his eyes were clear and focused. He grabbed Tommy's arm with his remaining strength. "Brennan, bazooka, bridge, you know what to do." Tommy looked out through the shattered doorway and saw them coming. 5 Panzer tanks leading a column of infantry and support vehicles rolling straight toward the bridge. He looked back at the wounded men around him. Eddie Montoya with a stomach wound. Robert Chen, the medic trying to stop the bleeding Red Sullivan, watching him with absolute certainty that Tommy would do the right thing. He could run. No one would blame him. The smart thing, the safe thing would be to fall back and let the tanks pass. But if he did that, the 5 wounded men behind him would die. The bridge would fall. The German advance would continue. And everything Red Sullivan had taught him would mean nothing. Tommy picked up the bazooka, 1 rocket, 5 tanks, and a position that any officer in any army would call suicidal. He moved to the collapsed beam near the road, the spot he had identified as his only chance. No cover, no escape. Just the angle he needed to hit a tank in the side armor as it slowed down for the bottleneck. He remembered what he had written in his notebook months ago. Not the first tank, the middle. The lead Panther passed his position. Tommy did not fire. The first Panzer IV passed. He still did not fire. Anyone watching would have thought he was frozen with fear. But Tommy Brennan was not frozen. He was counting, calculating, waiting for the right spot at the right time. The third tank entered the bottleneck and began to slow down. Its side armor was exposed. Tommy squeezed the trigger. 300 yards back from the bridge inside the lead Panther tank, Oberleutnant Heinrich Vogel pressed his eye to the periscope and scanned the road ahead. The morning fog clung to the trees like smoke limiting visibility to less than 100 meters. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting across the frozen landscape. Vogel was 28 years old, a career officer who had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front before being transferred west for the Ardennes offensive. He had lost 2 brothers in this war, one at Stalingrad and one in Normandy. He was not arrogant. He was not reckless. He was careful, methodical, and very good at his job. "Maintain formation," he said into the radio. "Slow advance. Watch the flanks." His gunner glanced back at him. "You expect trouble, Herr Oberleutnant." "I always expect trouble." The scouts had reported that American forces had withdrawn after the artillery barrage. The road should be clear. But Vogel had learned long ago that roads were never truly clear, and scouts were often wrong. The column moved forward. 5 tanks, 3 half-tracks, supply vehicles bringing up the rear. Their objective was the bridge over the Amblève River. Once they crossed it, they would swing west and cut the supply lines to the American units trapped at Bastogne. A simple mission, a clean advance. Vogel watched the ruined factory on the left side of the road as they approached. Shattered walls, collapsed roof. No movement. His instincts told him something was wrong, but his orders told him to keep moving. He was still scanning the ruins when the third tank in his column exploded. The rocket came from nowhere. One moment the Panzer IV was rolling forward with infantry riding on its hull. The next moment its side armor erupted in a fountain of fire and shrapnel. The sound hit Vogel like a physical blow, rattling his teeth. He saw men flying through the air bodies, tumbling across the snow flames, shooting from the hatches. "Contact left," his gunner screamed. "Anti-tank position in the factory." Vogel grabbed the radio and shouted orders. "All units halt, return fire on the factory infantry, dismount and flank." But even as he spoke, he realized the trap they had walked into. The third tank was burning in the middle of the road, completely blocking the column. The first 2 tanks could not reverse without colliding with the wreckage. The 4th and 5th tanks were stuck behind it with nowhere to go. One shot, one perfectly placed shot, and his entire formation was paralyzed. Vogel had seen this tactic before on the Eastern Front. Russian tank hunters who understood that destroying the middle vehicle was more effective than destroying the first. It required patience, precision, and nerves of steel. Whoever had fired that rocket knew exactly what they were doing. "How many guns?" he demanded. "Unknown, Herr Oberleutnant. At least 1 anti-tank position, possibly more." Vogel believed he was facing a squad of American tank hunters, perhaps 4 to 6 men with multiple bazookas. A serious threat, but manageable with superior firepower. He would pin them down with tank guns while infantry flanked and eliminated them. He did not know that there was only 1 man in that factory with a weapon. He did not know that the single rocket had been the last one available. That lack of knowledge would cost him everything. Tommy Brennan did not wait to see the results of his shot. The moment the rocket left the tube, he dropped the empty bazooka and ran. He sprinted through the ruins, zigzagging between collapsed walls and piles of debris. Behind him, he could hear the Germans shouting, the clatter of machine gun fire, the crack of bullets punching through brick and stone. Snow and dust erupted around his feet as rounds struck the ground inches from his boots. He dove through a hole in the factory wall and rolled across the frozen floor, gasping for breath. His lungs burned from the cold air. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip his rifle. But he was alive, and the third tank was burning. Tommy looked around the shattered interior. He needed another weapon, something with more firepower than his M1 Garand. Near the body of a dead soldier, he spotted a Browning automatic rifle with half a magazine still loaded. He grabbed it and moved to a blown-out window facing the road. The Germans were reorganizing. Infantry had dismounted from the half-tracks and were spreading out seeking cover behind trees and wrecked vehicles. A machine gun team was setting up near the second tank. Officers were shouting orders pointing toward the factory. Tommy raised the bar and began firing. He did not spray bullets like they did in the movies. He fired in short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds at a time, each burst aimed at a specific target. The machine gun team went down before they could get their weapon operational. An officer who had been directing the infantry spun and fell. 2 soldiers trying to flank around the left side crumpled into the snow. 15 seconds, maybe 20. Then the bar clicked empty. Tommy dropped it and moved again. He knew he could not stay in one position. The Germans would zero in on his muzzle flash. He had to keep moving, keep them guessing, make them think there were more Americans than there actually were. He found an M1 Garand with a full clip and moved to a different window. A soldier running across open ground. A tank commander who had opened his hatch. A radio man trying to call for support. Each shot was precise. Each target was chosen for maximum effect. But he was running out of ammunition, and the Germans were starting to figure out what they were dealing with. Vogel stood in his turret hatch binoculars, pressed to his eyes, trying to make sense of what was happening. The fire from the factory was accurate and disciplined, but it was coming from only one location at a time. First a window on the ground floor, then a gap in the wall on the left side, then another window on the second floor. The pattern suggested a single shooter moving between positions rather than multiple defenders. Herr Oberleutnant, his radio man said, Feldwebel Brown reports no contact on the right flank. The factory appears to be defended by a small force, perhaps only 1 or 2 men. Vogel lowered his binoculars. 1 or 2 men. That shot on the third tank had been too good, too perfectly timed to come from an amateur. If there was only 1 American in that factory, he was either very lucky or very skilled. Either way, he needed to die. Send a squad around the north flank, Vogel ordered. Move slowly and watch for reaction. I want to know exactly what we are facing. Tommy knew he was out of time. The Germans were massing for a coordinated assault. He could see infantry gathering behind the second tank preparing to rush the factory from multiple directions. Once they got inside, it would be over. He needed something bigger. He looked out toward the bridge and saw it. The knocked-out American half-track from the morning's artillery barrage sitting abandoned near the road. Mounted on its roof was a .50 caliber machine gun. The weapon was still intact. If it still worked, it could tear through infantry and light armor. It could suppress the entire German force long enough for him to figure out his next move. But the half-track was completely exposed. There was no cover between the factory and the vehicle. To reach it, he would have to run 30 yards across open ground in full view of 5 tanks and several dozen infantry. It was suicide. Tommy looked back at the wounded men behind him. Red Sullivan was watching, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes sharp and focused. Go, Red whispered. Right spot, right time. Tommy took a breath. Then he ran. The moment he cleared the factory wall, the world erupted in gunfire. Bullets snapped past his head, kicked up geysers of snow at his feet, sparked off the metal debris scattered across the ground. He could hear the Germans shouting, could feel the air splitting around him as rounds passed inches from his body. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to dive for cover. He kept running. 20 yards, 15, 10. He reached the half-track and threw himself onto its hull, scrambling up the side toward the mounted gun. His hands closed around the grips of the .50 caliber. He racked the charging handle, felt the bolt slam forward, and swung the barrel toward the road. The gun roared to life. Tommy had never fired a .50 caliber machine gun before. The recoil was enormous, the sound deafening, the vibration so intense it felt like the weapon was trying to tear itself free. But he held on and swept the barrel across the German positions. The effect was devastating. .50 caliber rounds punched through tree trunks, shattered stone walls, tore through the light armor of the half-tracks. Infantry who had been preparing to assault the factory dove for cover or simply ceased to exist. A Panzer IV that had been trying to maneuver around the burning wreckage took multiple hits to its vision ports and ground to a halt, its crew blinded and the vehicle disabled. For the first time since the battle began, the German advance halted completely. Vogel grabbed the radio and shouted his report to regimental headquarters. Heavy resistance at the bridge, anti-tank guns, and heavy machine guns in multiple positions. At least 6 to 8 defensive emplacements. Request immediate air support. But even as he made the report, doubt crept into his mind. The volume of fire was intense, but all of it seemed to be coming from just 2 locations. The factory windows and the half-track. 2 positions, not 6 or 8. He would test his theory by sending a probing attack from the north. If there was a real defensive force, they would shift men to meet the threat. If there was only one man, he would be forced to abandon one position. Send the second squad around the north side, he ordered. Move slowly and watch for reaction. 30 minutes into the battle, Tommy knew the .50 caliber would not last. The barrel was overheating, steam rising from the metal despite the freezing temperature. He forced himself to fire in shorter bursts, conserving ammunition and letting the weapon cool. That was when he saw the squad moving around the north side of the factory. They were trying to flank him. If they got into the building from that direction, they would have a clear shot at the wounded men. And Tommy was stuck on the half-track too far away to intercept them. He had to move. Now! Tommy fired one last long burst to force the Germans into cover, then threw himself off the half-track and sprinted back toward the factory. He grabbed a dead soldier's M1 Garand and scrambled to the north windows just as the flanking squad came into view. The first German went down before he knew he was being shot at. The second dove behind a tree and returned fire. Tommy shifted position, found another angle, and dropped 2 more before they could reach cover. The flanking attack collapsed. The survivors retreated back toward the main German line. But Tommy had revealed something important. The Germans had probed his position and found it defended by a single gun. The next attack would come from multiple directions at once. He needed another weapon, something that could stop a tank. Moving through the factory, searching the bodies of dead soldiers, he found ammunition clips, 1 fragmentation grenade, and a canteen of water that had frozen solid. Then in the wreckage of an overturned Jeep outside the factory's rear entrance, he found it, a single M6A3 rocket for the bazooka. His heart pounded as he pulled it from the vehicle and brushed off the snow. It looked intact, no visible damage. If the propellant had not gotten wet, it should still fire. He crawled back to where he had dropped the bazooka and loaded the rocket with trembling fingers. 1 more shot. That was all he had. He would have to make it count. 1 hour into the battle, Vogel received the report he had been dreading. Herr Oberleutnant, the flanking squad encountered only 1 shooter. They believe the factory is defended by a single American. A single American. 1 man had destroyed 1 of his tanks, disabled another, killed or wounded more than a dozen of his soldiers, and stopped his entire column for over an hour. Vogel felt a strange mixture of fury and respect. Whoever this American was, he was either the bravest man Vogel had ever encountered or the most foolish. Perhaps both. Then we finish this, Vogel said quietly. All units prepare for coordinated assault. Tanks will provide covering fire. Infantry will advance from 3 directions. I want that factory reduced to rubble. The assault began at 7:45. 3 tanks opened fire simultaneously, their shells smashing into the factory walls and sending cascades of brick and stone tumbling down. Under cover of the bombardment, German infantry began advancing from the south, west, and north, converging on the building from 3 directions. Tommy crouched in the wreckage with his last rocket loaded in the bazooka. He could not stop all of them, but he could stop 1 more tank. He watched through a crack in the wall as a Panzer IV broke away from the main group and began moving around the north side of the factory. It was trying to get behind him to cut off any possibility of retreat. If that tank got into position, everyone inside would die. Tommy moved to the north wall and found a hole large enough to fire through. He shouldered the bazooka and waited. The tank was moving cautiously, its turret traversing back and forth as the crew searched for threats. Come on, Tommy thought. Show me your side. The tank reached the corner of the factory and began to turn. For just a moment, its flank was exposed. Tommy fired. The rocket streaked across the gap and slammed into the Panzer's side armor just below the turret ring. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic. The tank shuddered, then erupted in flames as the ammunition inside cooked off. The hatches blew open and smoke poured out. No one emerged. Tommy dropped the empty bazooka. He was out of rockets, out of heavy weapons, down to his rifle and a handful of bullets, and the Germans were still coming. 2 hours into the battle, something strange happened. Tommy was moving between positions when he came face to face with a German soldier. The man was young, maybe 19 or 20, with a thin face and frightened eyes. He was crouched behind a section of collapsed wall, clutching his rifle, breathing hard. They saw each other at the same moment. Tommy's hand was already on his Garand. The German's finger was on his trigger. They were 5 yards apart. At that range, neither could miss. For a long moment, neither moved. Tommy looked into the German's eyes and saw what he felt in his own chest. Exhaustion, fear, the desperate desire to survive. This was not a monster. This was a kid just like Tommy who had been thrown into a frozen hell and was trying to get out alive. 2 seconds passed. 3. Then without a word, both men turned and ran in opposite directions. Tommy never spoke about that moment to anyone, but for years afterward, in the quiet hours of sleepless nights, he would see those eyes. Not the eyes of an enemy, the eyes of another 19-year-old boy who wanted to go home. By 9 o'clock, Tommy was down to his last magazine. The Germans had pushed to within 20 yards of the factory. Infantry was massing for a final rush. The 2 remaining tanks were positioning themselves to blast the building apart at point-blank range. He climbed to the second floor and found a window overlooking the road. He raised his rifle and began picking off targets. A soldier running between cover positions. A machine gunner setting up his weapon. An officer pointing and shouting commands. He hit one of the tank commanders in the shoulder. The man tumbled back into his hatch and the tank stopped moving. But the other vehicles kept coming. The infantry kept advancing. There were too many of them. Then Tommy heard a sound that made his heart stop. Artillery. American artillery. Coming from the east. The first shells landed among the German infantry, sending bodies flying and scattering the assault force. More rounds followed, walking across the road and into the tank positions. The Germans began to fall back, abandoning their attack as explosions erupted around them. Reinforcements had arrived. Tommy watched through the shattered window as the remaining German tanks reversed down the road, disappearing around a bend. Infantry scattered into the forest. The assault was over. At 9:30 in the morning, after 3 hours of continuous combat, the road fell silent. Tommy slumped against the wall and let his rifle drop to the floor. His hands were burned from gripping overheated weapons. His leg was dark with blood from a shrapnel wound he had not even noticed. His ears rang so loudly he could barely hear his own breathing. But he was alive. The bridge was intact, and the 5 wounded men in the factory were still breathing. He made his way back down to them. Red Sullivan looked up as he approached, and for the first time since the battle began, Red smiled. "You did it, Brennan." Tommy did not answer. He sat down beside his wounded comrades, leaned his head back against the wall, and watched the snow fall through the hole in the roof. When the smoke began to clear, Tommy Brennan did not feel like a hero. He felt like he was dying. His body throbbed with pain. His leg, his arms, his hands. He had not slept in 36 hours. He had not eaten in nearly a day. The cold was biting harder now that the adrenaline was wearing off, seeping into his bones like poison. But the road was silent. For the first time that morning, no tanks growled. No boots thundered on stone. No mortars fell. Only the soft hiss of snow landing on scorched metal. Tommy looked out toward the bridge. It was still intact, unoccupied, unbroken, and most importantly, unreached. Behind him, the 5 wounded Americans he had shielded were alive. All of them were breathing. All of them would make it out. Robert Chen, the medic, looked at Tommy with exhausted eyes. "You need to let me check that leg." Tommy glanced down. His left trouser leg was soaked through. He nodded and let Chen cut away the fabric and clean the wound. The shrapnel had missed the bone and the major blood vessels. A lucky wound if such a thing existed. Chen bandaged it tight and told Tommy to stay off his feet. Tommy nodded but did not sit down. He stood at the doorway of the ruined factory and watched the empty road rifle in his hands, waiting for the Germans to return. They did not return. 3 days later, in a makeshift American detention facility near Malmedy, Oberleutnant Heinrich Vogel sat across from an American intelligence officer. Vogel's face was gaunt. His uniform was torn and stained with oil and blood. His column had been destroyed the day after the battle at the factory. American artillery and air power had caught them on an open road south of Stavelo and left nothing but burning wreckage. Vogel had survived by luck. Most of his men had not. The intelligence officer, a captain from Chicago named Harrison, placed a file on the table between them. "I want to ask you about the engagement at the bridge on December 21st. Harrison said. Your unit was stopped by an American defensive position for approximately 3 hours. Can you describe the force you encountered? Vogel straightened in his chair. Even as a prisoner, he carried himself with the bearing of a professional soldier. We encountered a well-prepared defensive position, he said in accented but clear English. At least one squad of anti-tank gunners, possibly two. Multiple machine gun emplacements covering the approaches. Disciplined fire, accurate shooting, coordinated defense. They knew exactly what they were doing. Harrison nodded and made a note. How many Americans would you estimate were defending that position? 8 to 10 men, Vogel said without hesitation. Possibly more. The fire came from multiple locations. They repositioned frequently to prevent us from fixing their positions. Classic defensive tactics. Harrison reached into the file and pulled out a photograph. He slid it across the table to Vogel. The photograph showed a young American soldier standing in front of the ruined factory. His face was covered in dirt and dried blood. His uniform was torn. He was holding an empty bazooka in one hand and looked like he had not slept in a week. This is the force that stopped your column, Harrison said. Vogel looked at the photograph. Then he looked up at Harrison. I do not understand. One man, Harrison said, Private First Class Thomas Brennan, 19 years old, from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He held that position alone for 3 hours with a bazooka, a machine gun, and a rifle. He destroyed 2 of your tanks, disabled a third, and killed or wounded approximately 15 of your soldiers. By himself. Vogel stared at the photograph for a long moment. His expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. Disbelief, perhaps, or recognition. That is not possible, he said quietly. And yet it happened. Vogel was silent. He picked up the photograph and studied the young face looking back at him. A boy, younger than most of the men Vogel had commanded, younger than his brothers had been when they died. If what you say is true, Vogel said finally, then this soldier is either the bravest man I have ever encountered or the most fortunate. Maybe both, Harrison said. Vogel set the photograph down. May I ask what happened to him? He survived. He is being recommended for the Medal of Honor. Vogel nodded slowly. He deserves it. He paused, then added something that Harrison would remember for the rest of his career. In 3 years of war, I have never seen anything like this. One man should not be able to do what he did, but he did it. And because he did it, my column failed, my men died, and your line held. He looked at Harrison. If your army has more soldiers like this one, then Germany has already lost this war. Word of Vogel's interrogation spread through the prisoner camp. Other captured Germans confirmed the story. They had believed they were facing a full defensive platoon. Some had reported seeing muzzle flashes from 6 or 8 different positions. Others had sworn there were multiple machine gun nests. They had been wrong. There had been only one man. But the smoke, the fire, the constant movement between positions, and the precise shooting had created the illusion of a much larger force. The Germans began calling the position Die Geister Stellung, the ghost position, a place defended by phantoms. The psychological impact rippled outward. German soldiers who heard the story began to doubt their own assessments of American strength. If one man could do this, how many more were waiting behind every ruined building and tree line? The confidence that had carried the Wehrmacht through the first week of the Ardennes offensive began to crack. One man, one bridge, one crack in the armor of German certainty. It was a small thing in the vastness of the war, but small things have a way of growing. The strategic impact of Tommy's stand became clear in the days that followed. Vogel's column had been ordered to seize the bridge over the Amblève and advance west, cutting the supply lines to American units trapped at Bastogne. If they had succeeded, thousands of American soldiers would have been encircled without food, ammunition, or reinforcements. But Vogel's column did not succeed. They were stopped at the factory for 3 hours, long enough for American artillery to move into position and for reinforcements to arrive. When the Germans finally retreated and attempted to swing south, they drove straight into a killing zone. The delay that Tommy had created allowed the American line to hold. The road remained open. Supplies continued to flow. Bastogne did not fall. After action reports from the 30th Infantry Division noted that Private Brennan's actions had directly contributed to the preservation of the northern flank. One estimate suggested that his 3-hour stand had prevented the encirclement of 2,000 to 3,000 American troops. Tommy never saw those reports. He never knew the full scope of what he had accomplished. All he knew was that he had held the bridge and that the men behind him had survived. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything. On July 27, 1945, 7 months after the battle at Stavelot Private First Class, Thomas Brennan stood in the White House and received the Medal of Honor from President Harry S. Truman. The citation read in part, "Private Brennan's extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty at the risk of his own life above and beyond the call of duty reflect the highest traditions of the military service and bring great credit upon himself, the 30th Infantry Division, and the United States Army." Tommy was 20 years old. He was one of the youngest recipients of the Medal of Honor in World War II. When reporters asked him how he felt about the award, he gave an answer that would be quoted for decades. "I just did what had to be done. Anyone in my position would have done the same." He did not elaborate. He did not boast. He took the medal, shook the president's hand, and went home to Pennsylvania. The war was over. The rest of his life was about to begin. Tommy returned to Scranton in the autumn of 1945. He did not march in parades. He did not give speeches. He went back to his mother's house, slept in his childhood bed, and tried to remember what normal life felt like. It did not come easily. He woke at night with the sound of tank treads in his ears. He smelled burning metal when there was no fire. He saw the face of the young German soldier in his dreams, the one who had looked at him across 5 yards of frozen rubble and chosen not to shoot. He never told anyone about those nights. Not his mother, not his friends. He buried it deep and kept moving forward because that was what soldiers did. In 1947, he married Margaret O'Brien, a girl he had known since high school. Maggie, everyone called her. She had written to him every week during the war, long letters about nothing important that had meant everything to a boy freezing in a foxhole an ocean away. Maggie was the only person Tommy ever told about the nightmares. She did not try to fix him. She did not offer advice. She just listened, and sometimes that was enough. They had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Tommy taught them how to throw a baseball and how to change a tire. He did not teach them about war. He opened a small garage in Scranton, just like he had always planned. Brennan Auto Repair. He fixed engines and transmissions, replaced brakes and spark plugs, did the quiet work of keeping machines running. His customers liked him because he was honest and because he never charged more than the job was worth. The Medal of Honor stayed in a drawer in his bedroom. He did not hang it on the wall. When his children asked about it, he told them it was an old award from the Army. He did not tell them what he had done to earn it. In 1950, Tommy made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He applied for a job at the Veterans Administration Office in Philadelphia. For the next 35 years, he worked there helping other soldiers navigate the maze of paperwork and benefits that the government required. Disability claims, medical referrals, pension applications. The tedious, frustrating, essential work of making sure that the men who had served were not forgotten. He never explained why he took the job. But Maggie knew. It was because of Red Sullivan. Red had survived the war, but the wounds he suffered at the factory had left him unable to work. When he applied for disability benefits in 1946, his paperwork was lost in the system for 8 months. He nearly lost his house. His family nearly went hungry. Tommy drove 6 hours to Washington to find out what had happened. He discovered that thousands of veterans were in the same situation, their files buried in bureaucratic backlogs, their sacrifices forgotten by the system they had served. Tommy could not fix the whole system, but he could help one veteran at a time. So that was what he did for 35 years until he retired in 1985. The Medal of Honor stayed in the drawer. Tommy never mentioned it at work. His colleagues knew him as a quiet man who was good at his job and who never turned away a veteran in need. That was enough. Eddie Montoya survived as well. His stomach wound took months to heal, but he made it home to New Mexico. In 1948, he opened a small bakery in Albuquerque, just like he had always planned. He named his first pastry after his grandmother. He sent Tommy a Christmas card every year with a photograph of his family and his shop. The card stopped coming in 2001. Tommy kept every single one of them in a shoebox in his closet. Red Sullivan died in 1978. Tommy drove to Boston for the funeral and sat in the back of the church. Afterward, Red's widow found him and took his hands. "He talked about you," she said, "all the time. He said you were the best soldier he ever knew." Tommy shook his head. "Red was the one who taught me. I just did what he said." "No," she replied. "You did what nobody else could do." And he never forgot it. Tommy drove home that night and did not speak for a long time. Some debts could never be repaid. Some words could never be said. All you could do was keep living and hope that it meant something. In 2009, Tommy's hometown honored him by naming the local post office after him. The Thomas Brennan Post Office, a small brick building on a quiet street in Scranton. A year later, a statue was erected in a park in Buffalo, depicting the moment he had raised his bazooka to fire at the German column. Tommy attended the dedication ceremony. He was 84 years old, white-haired and walking with a cane, but his eyes were still sharp. He looked at the bronze figure for a long time without speaking. Finally, Maggie asked him what he thought. "It does not look like me," he said. "I was not that brave. I was just a scared kid trying to keep his friends alive." Maggie took his arm. "That is what brave means," she said. In 2010, a man named Michael Chen knocked on the door of Tommy's house in South Bethlehem. He was 65 years old, well-dressed, with graying hair and kind eyes. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "my name is Michael Chen. My father was Robert Chen. He was the medic who treated your leg at the factory in Belgium." Tommy stared at him for a moment. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. "I will make coffee." They talked for 3 hours. Michael told Tommy that his father had spoken about that day until the end of his life. He had told the story to his children and his grandchildren. He had said that Tommy Brennan was the reason he had survived to come home to Mary to have a family. "My father died in 1998, Michael said, "but he wanted me to find you. He wanted me to tell you that everything I am, everything my children are exist because of what you did that morning." Tommy was quiet for a long time. His coffee grew cold in his hands. Finally, he said, "I think about them. Red, Eddie, your father, all of them. I think about them every day." "They thought about you too," Michael said. "You gave them that chance." When Michael left, Tommy stood at the window and watched him drive away. Maggie came and stood beside him. "Are you all right?" she asked. Tommy nodded slowly. He did not have to come. He did not have to say those things. But he did. "Yes." Tommy paused. "I think that is the only thing I ever needed to hear." Thomas Brennan died on October 8, 2019. He was 94 years old. His obituary in the Scranton newspaper mentioned his service in World War II. It mentioned his work at the Veterans Administration. It mentioned his wife and children and grandchildren. It did not mention the 3 hours at the factory. It did not mention the tanks he had destroyed or the men he had saved. It did not mention the Medal of Honor in his drawer. Tommy would have wanted it that way. In a quiet ceremony after his death, Tommy's family donated his Medal of Honor to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. It sits there now in a glass case next to a photograph of a young soldier with a dirt-streaked face and exhausted eyes. The plaque beneath it tells the story of what he did that December morning in Belgium. 3 hours, one man, one bridge held. But it does not tell the whole story. It cannot. It does not tell you about the young German soldier who looked at Tommy across the rubble and chose not to shoot. It does not tell you about the nightmares that lasted for decades. It does not tell you about the 35 years Tommy spent helping other veterans because he could not forget the ones he had fought beside. It does not tell you that Tommy Brennan never believed he was special. He believed he was just a man who had been put in an impossible situation and had refused to run away from it. Maybe that is the most important thing. In 1988, a journalist asked Tommy what he would say to young people about courage. Tommy thought about it for a while. Then he said something that the journalist wrote down and that has been quoted many times since. "Do not wait for someone to tell you what is right. You know. You always know. The only question is whether you will do it." That is the legacy of Tommy Brennan. When the moment comes when there is no one else, when the cost is high and the odds are impossible, what will you do? Will you run, or will you choose the suicidal angle?